Okay, we're going to get started. We're going to get started if people can give your attention to the front of the room. That would be great. I want to welcome everybody back from the break. And we're going to continue forward with panel 2. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, great. We're going to continue forward with panel 2. The title of this panel is The Need for Commutation Through the Eyes of Victims and Former Prisoners. We wanted to just take a moment because Attorney Patty Guerin, you're going to hear from her later on, but in reference to the panel that was just there, she has some information, I think, that is vital for those of us to finish out our note-taking in regard to that panel. So I'm going to ask Attorney Patty Guerin if she could just make the comment she was going to make prior to the parole board exiting.
The point I was going to make before the members of the parole board left is there was a lot of talk about paroling rates. And if you measure a parole rate by the people who walk out the prison door on parole, and not by positive vote that someone might be paroled in 5 years or 2 years, but the number of people who walk out the door on parole, from the time of the Candace Cochin, Pamela Mardini board, those were the 2 members that were fired by the government in January of 2011, their board, if you compare their voting rate for parole to the Josh Wall board, the Department of Correction reports that the parole rate has dropped 58% in that 1-year period of time. That's not my statistic, that's the Department of Correction. 58% in that 1-year period of time. That is almost 600 extra people in prison this year because of the drop in parole rate. The prison overcrowding is out of control, and the drop in parole rate is a very big part of it. So just to clarify, that's from 2010, 2000, from the prior parole board to the present board.
Thank you, Attorney Guerin, and we're going to hear more from her in our next panel. Moving forward, we have a lot more information. I'm moderating this panel. My name is Andrea James. I am, yes, it's good to be here. I am recently released from a federal prison. I'm a former criminal defense attorney, now disbarred and having just been released from the Danbury Women's Prison in Danbury, Connecticut, and I am very happy to be standing before you today, and also to be in the presence of my sisters in the struggle and my brothers. Our panel is titled The Need for Commutation Through the Eyes of Victims and Former Prisoners. And I'm going to just introduce by name and then ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. To my left we have Tina Williams, Gail Hall, Jamie Bissonette, Hassan Smith, and Mr. Milton Jones. And we have a panel that's made up not only of former prisoners, but also of family members and victims. And I want to start with Tina Williams. If you could please, Tina, start by introducing yourself, telling us who you are, when you went to prison, when you came home, and what you're doing now.
Okay, my name is Tina Williams. I went to prison at the age of 19. I was extradited from Chicago here to Massachusetts. At that time, I had been trafficked for sexual purposes. I had been traumatized most of my life, and I was a victim of violence myself. In the commission of a crime to get money for the guy who trafficked me here, myself and another woman, we accidentally killed the guy. And so at the age of 19, and the same guy is the guy who brought the police to Chicago to have me arrested. So, and that was long before all this new verbiage about human trafficking, sex trade, domestic violence, post-traumatic stress disorder, battering. People weren't talking about that in 1970. So I went to Framingham Prison at 1971. Eventually, the jail was co-ed. I was there with Commissioner Boone, Governor Dukakis, Sheila Hubbard, who was sitting up here, Robert Gittins. They all know me. So eventually, I was paroled a couple of times because, I grew up in prison. So you learn from your environment. So I learned a lot of stuff in prison. And eventually, I was given a parole in 92, and I never went back. Since that time, I have gone on to college, which I started in prison. I graduated from UMass Boston. And I need to say, with people like Patty Guerin, she's just not here to, be on a panel. She walks the talk. She has been very instrumental in even in my sitting here. I would say if it wasn't for her, I wouldn't be sitting here. And Professor Ogletree, they are people who do the work. They just don't talk the work. They actually do it. So last year, I did my internship here at lovely Harvard University at the Criminal Justice Institute. And I graduated from Simmons College School of Social Work and a certificate in leadership and clinical social work. I work with homeless women, bag ladies, as you might see, the ones in Harvard Square, the ones in Central Square. Most of them are my clients. A lot of them I did time with. What was the other question?
That, for now, that's great.
Okay.
That's what you're doing currently.
Oh, currently I work with those women. I go to court with them. I advocate with judges, landlords, wherever they need advocacy. I help them try to become accustomed to living out in the streets, if they get apartments. A lot of the women have gotten apartments, teaching them how to live. Teaching women, I do workshops on teaching women who were addicts and who were hustlers and who just never were really a part of mainstream society, how to acclimate into society, how it's not okay to curse the lady out in CVS because she waited on the person behind you. And, how to help people meet their mental health needs. Do they need medication? Trying to talk to them about being on the medication. And I also just need to say that I'm not sure what the numbers are, but I'm sure that over 50% of women in prison have trauma, have mental health issues. And those are the same women that you see, the same women that I work with that sleep in the street. They have, a large percentage of them have mental health issues as a result of trauma.
Thank you, Tina.
You're welcome.
That statistic for Massachusetts is 90% of the women in Massachusetts. Our next panelist is Gail Hall. And Gail, if you can please tell us the same questions. I'll repeat them just so you know. Who are you? When did you go to prison? And when did you get out? And what are you doing now?
Okay. My name is Gail Hall, and when I went to prison, it was September of 1994. I was convicted of a second degree, and I was given a life sentence. And as much as I could, I worked in prison, and then I was there for like maybe 3 years. I found the law library, and I went up and taught myself how to read the books, and it was pretty interesting reading my own story in the books. It took a lot of courage to actually go back to those books and try to put my life together. so I got my case overturned in 2000. So it was 6 years to the day that I got my case overturned. Thank you. And what I'm doing now is I work at a university. I work at Brandeis University, but since I've been out of prison, my work has been in behavioral health, some paralegal stuff, and a HIV background. So I've been out for 12 years.
Thank you, Gail, thank you. I'm going to jump over Jamie temporarily. And I'm going to ask Mr. Hassan Smith to introduce yourself and answer those same questions.
My name is Hassan Smith. Hello to all and distinguished members of the panel. I was found delinquent of murder in the late 80s. Boston had its highest rate of homicides amongst juveniles. That year, I believe there was over 120 murders, and majority of them were committed by juveniles. And unfortunately, I fell into that group of juvenile murderers. There was testimony that said I should spend the rest of my life behind bars because I not only was a danger to myself, but also to society. After spending 3 years with the Department of Youth Services, I was finally rehabilitated. Sometime in the early 90s, I requested that my juvenile record be sealed. It was sealed after I had written a letter stating why I wanted it to be sealed, and was able to show proof that I was on my way towards becoming a model citizen by the help of credible references. The purpose behind a sealed juvenile record is so that my future is not hindered. No one had access to my record, not even law enforcement agencies. In 1993, I applied to the Suffolk County Sheriff's Department. After an intensive investigation, I was offered a position as a law enforcement officer. I was stunned when they sent me to the gun range and taught me how to fire a gun. I also had my personal firearms license to carry a firearm. So all this for 10 years. And needless to say, I am blessed. I worked for the Sheriff's Department for 10 years and also had a part-time job doing armed security. None of this would have been possible if my record was not sealed. I also took over the responsibility of raising my daughter by myself when she was just 1 year old. My daughter now is 20 and is in her second year in college, majoring in criminal justice. Commutation.
Well, we're going to go back, we'll come back.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, thank
Hassan.
you.
We're going to jump back now. Jamie, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, Jamie, and why are you here?
Dungok, Nidapiag, Nil Tluisal, Bemusad Muin, Nil Gwinek, Bilomial, Naga, Nil, Abenaki, Missisqui. Imi, Gaki Galwisid, Musam Suks, Wajukaman. Gukmasnuk, Wajukaman. Wazizuk, Wajukaman. Apijik, Wajukaman. Naga, Skidabeg, Wajukaman. Naga, Sanke, Suakan, Noluwu. Good afternoon. I just introduced myself in the traditional way of my people. I'm sitting before you in a really different capacity. I'm often asked to speak about criminal justice policy, but today Kazi asked me to sit here in a capacity that's very hard for me to speak about. I experienced extreme level of sexual and physical violence as a child. Sexual and physical violence described by those who found me as rising to the level of torture. As a teenager, I lost 2 of my family members to murder. I'm biracial, Native American. My people are 6 times more likely to go to prison than any other ethnic group, and over half of the juveniles serving life sentences in the Federal Bureau of Prisons are Native American. So when I received a scholarship, my grandfather said to me, I know this is going to be hard for you, but maybe you should focus on that. Maybe you should focus on what's happening to our people in prison, what's happening to people in prison, and how we can heal. And I think that's the conversation I pray we come to, because the criminal justice question here is framed by the reality that there is such a huge need for healing. We are torn apart as a people. And just as I did not know I could heal, or even how to do that, until I was quite far into my 3rd decade of my life, many of my brothers and sisters who are in prison also don't know the clear path to healing for themselves. And those resources, are just not there. And without those resources, conversations about restorative justice and about changing policy become kind of hollow, without creating that sacred space for healing. A few years ago, I left Boston. I've been in the position at the AFSC since 1996. I left Boston to go home because I was asked to open the door for Native prisoners in the Supermax in Maine to do the core ceremony of our people, which is the sweat lodge ceremony. And I was left to do something which I think everyone in this panel does, to negotiate the non-negotiable. I had to convince the Department of Corrections that we needed fire. We needed large lava rocks. We needed wood. We needed long poles. We needed a metal rod to make holes in the earth. We needed an axe to chop the wood in a Supermax. We needed tobacco. We needed a pipe to smoke that tobacco in. And we needed all of our other medicines. And no, it could not be any different. No, we could not use a sauna electric heater in a sweat lodge. No, we could not substitute PVC piping for poles cut from the ash that our people walked out of. No, we could not substitute. So how do we negotiate the non-negotiable? Today, there's a sweat lodge in the middle of the maximum security prison, visible outside. And it was, that applause is for everyone in this room. And it was after that I was given the name that I introduced myself with by my elders. And the name I had before had to do with a very troublesome fox. And the new name that I was given was Walking Bear. And if any of you have ever seen a mother bear, even an image of a mother bear stand up on their legs to take on a very large thing that might be harming their child, you know what that's about. And I was given that name because of the work that I did in the prisons. And the last thing I want to say is Milton and I are here to be the voice of people who have lost loved ones to murder, or who have experienced violence. And I think probably everyone in this room has experienced violence. Recently, I was in Canada. My grandmother was in an Indian residential school, and all of us were spoken to by an elder, and he said, "I know you're here as victims, but you are more than victims. You are more than survivors. You are heroes." And I'm sitting on a panel of heroes here, and I know, and I look around, I see so many familiar faces, and that is who we are. We are all shining heroes, no matter what. We are taught as children that we tell the truth, but the truth we tell is the good about every person.
Thank you, Jamie.
And I leave you with that.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Milton Jones. I come from the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute. There, we unfortunately and fortunately have the task of sitting with families who have lost loved ones to murder. I'm probably speaking to the choir right now because my sense is that everyone in this room is probably for parole, is probably for commutation, is probably recognizing those things that I would be saying this evening. I come from a victim perspective. I lost a son. He was 18 years old in 1993, and he was murdered. The perpetrators were apprehended and convicted, or rather, they entered a plea bargain and only served 7 years. Now, there are many who would say, 7 years? Are you kidding? That's all? I would say, and did say, and do say, that's not my call. 7 years, 10 years, 20 years, 3 years, it's not my call. I have a creator. His name is God. It's his call. So I come from a place where there is a change in attitude, a change in mindset as far as reconciliation is concerned, as far as forgiveness is concerned. At the Peace Institute, we talk forgiveness, we talk reconciliation, we talk faith, we talk love, we talk all these kinds of emotions and these kinds of qualities that we believe are not only in the victims who were perpetrated upon, but are also in the perpetrators who perpetrated upon these victims. So I'll leave it there, and we'll move on from here.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. I want to start with 3 questions that we're going to ask each of the panelists, and then we'll give people an opportunity to ask questions. And I want to start with Tina because she may have to leave. And Tina, let me just give you the first one. Why do you feel commutation is important for people doing life sentences? Why is that important? What are we here for? To raise dialogue and awareness about. Why is this so important?
So the only analogy that I can make is personal. My situation as compared to the women who were labeled the Framingham 8, who were also in jail for various degrees of self-defense, murder, manslaughter, whatever. So those women, we got out at the same time, some of us. Their sentences were commuted down to years, which meant that, you know, they got good time for being in prison, and that their parole was not infinite. My situation, I had a sentence of second degree. First, I had a sentence of first degree. Then it went down to second degree, which is 15 to life. That was in 1971. Today is May 16th, 2012. I am still on parole. In spite of, and so that's the difference. And that's the benefit of what a commutation can do. And then you hear Milton talk about the perpetrators of his son's death. And then you go back to more systemic and oppression. Had my victim been another little black girl on the street, I would have been off parole. I mean, and you know, and that's just the way that the justice system is, and it's from the top to the bottom. So I'm still on parole, but with the benefit of a commutation, those women are free. And guess what? A couple of them are my clients. A couple of them face homelessness, are homeless, caught up in addiction, and they come to me for services. But that is a big benefit of commutation, that it ends that part of the systemic oppression, because you know there's a whole bigger picture. We're not going to go into that, but yeah. So it ends that piece of the criminal justice system being in your life. Now, so for 42 years later, I went from 19, I'm 61. I know I look good, you don't have to tell me. But, you know, no, from then until now. So you think all of those years, the taxpayers have been charged a fee for my being on parole. When that guy got out on parole and killed the cop, you know, it's almost like, I don't even want to say like Nazism, because then you get scared. They're coming for me next. You know, my parole officer, oh, we got to come to your house every week now. I have to see you every week. We need a urine. You haven't had a urine in years. You know, but you need a urine now. And then we know it's not your fault, but the bottom line is no parole officer is going to lose their mortgage, their car note for me. So, you know, push come to shove, if somebody has to go, it would be me. And that's how I live my life. And it's fearful because anything could happen. I could run a red light and hit someone accidentally. I'm gone. And so, but if I were allowed the opportunity to have my sentence commuted, I wouldn't be in there. So the oppression never ends. When do you finish paying back? My victim's family wrote a letter to the parole board in '87 saying that they felt that I should have never been given a life sentence. That obviously that didn't have an impact. You know, but if you write a victim's impact statement, say I want life in a day, that might have an impact. So that's my take on the difference between commutation and parole. And thank God for Arnie King, because if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't be having this discussion. You know, no one would even be thinking about it. You know, but it's scary. It's scary being on parole. Patty tried. They tried twice so far to get me off parole. And not this parole board, because everybody's like, well, you might as well forget it. Don't even try now. Just wait till I don't know when. But the last time we tried, they said, Ms. Williams is doing what we expect parolees to do. So getting a master's degree, raising my granddaughter, helping the homeless, working with people with HIV. The only thing I read the book, if I could save a correctional officer's life, I could get an instant pardon. So if, you know, and so that is my take on commutation. So I want to thank you for having me. I have to go get my granddaughter. I'm sorry. Bye.
Gail, I'd like to ask you, thank you, Tina. I'd like to, Gail, ask you to tell us, you know, why do you feel commutation is important?
Okay, it's not going to be as long as Tina's explanation, because I haven't been on parole before.
I want to get that money.
Yeah. I think commutation is important to people because it gives them another avenue. Can you hear me? It gives them another avenue to pursue, because I've been to parole hearings before, and it's like seeing a jury trial all over again, because they throw back in the person's face the crime and, well, don't you feel sorry? And how do you expect us to let you out when you've done this? I mean, you know, it's ridiculous. You should be, well, the parole board should be, you know, concentrating on how long they've been in there, how well they've done, what programs they've done, anything that they've done, that the prisoner has done to better themselves. So I think commutation is like another avenue for them to pursue. I mean, I don't think anybody's been paroled in the last, how long?
10 years.
Yeah.
Oh, parole,
So-
well, Patty,
So,
commuted in 10 years.
commuted. Never. It hasn't. So anyway, yeah, but that's all I have to say.
All right, these next two questions I want to, because I really want to get out some information, and we have to keep our panel moving along. I want to ask these two questions of Mr. Smith and of Mr. Jones. And I'd like to start with Milton, if you would, please. Tell us, how important is education during a prisoner's incarceration, from your perspective?
Well, certainly, without an education, one is subject to even further oppression, if you will. I think it's extremely necessary that one seeks to educate himself while incarcerated. Obviously, that is one of the factors that I'm aware of that the parole board uses in determining whether a person is paroled or even commuted, if such a thing can ever happen, a commutation. That education is a foundation that one can stand on while out in the community, and has a better opportunity to succeed in the community if one is educated. And it goes into all sorts of different factors, such as self-esteem, for one. If a person has a low self-esteem, he's subject to not do well in terms of his quest to succeed in society. So I think that it's extremely important, education for a prisoner.
And as somebody who was, who lost a son to violence, and still works to help to educate other young men who may victimize another young man in our community, it's of utmost importance to you.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I'm one who considers, and I think it was mentioned earlier today, who considers the conditions of an individual who is incarcerated, particularly incarcerated as a young person. The two individuals that murdered my son were his age. They were both 17 and 18 years old. They had all sorts of trauma in their life. They had more trauma in their life than he did, because he didn't have any. He was raised well. And this was an altercation that happened. Kids get into things and get into fights and things as teenagers, and so something happened, and they saw fit to, in their warped thinking, saw fit to retaliate. But again, they had all sorts of problems. We found out later that there was some abuse and things that went on, and Dad wasn't all that he should have been, and things of that nature. And we know that those are all factors that sort of drive people to criminal activity in some cases. And I think that those things have to be recognized, and they have to be considered before just throwing people in prison and leaving them there forever and a day. Everyone, as we say, deserves a second chance. I believe in the human element. These are human beings. These are not machines or anything. These are people first. Convict later, drug addict later, but people first. And if we can treat the problem, then let's treat the problem and give them a second chance.
Hassan, you were a child sent to prison. You have a very unique experience as somebody here today, because in addition to that, you did receive an education, but you also received an education from Arnie King. Tell us, from your perspective, how important is education?
Before I go ahead with that, can I just give Mr. Milton Jones a standing ovation? And the reason why I did that because, thank you, and the reason why I did that for Mr. Jones, because I think it's very hard for a person in his situation to be here under these circumstances and advocate for people that are on parole or want commutation. But getting back to the other question, which she had asked me, when I was 16 years old, I committed the crime when I was 15, and I just turned 16. And back then they had a Part A, Part B transfer hearing. They don't have that no longer. And that's to see whether you're gonna spend the rest of your life in prison or you're gonna serve time as a juvenile delinquent. So I remember my attorney coming to me telling me, Mr. Smith, be on your best behavior, because the district attorney is looking to send you to prison for the rest of your life. And if you go to jail for the rest of your life, you're not coming home unless you're in a box. So at the time they had a program where they took juvenile delinquents and they sent them up to prison, and they sent them up to prisons and to speak whatever life is, adult life is. And Mr. Arnie King was my mentor. And he said to me, listen, young blood, you got a second chance. I might not leave here unless I'm in a box. Now you can either go out there and do it right, or you can be in here with me. And I looked around those damn walls, and I said, I ain't coming back. Now, Mr. King, after I got the job with the sheriff's department, I went to one of his parole hearings. While in uniform, and before I said anything, I acknowledged my sympathy for Arnie's victim and his family. But I said to the parole board that Arnie King would do more good being out here with people versus being inside, behind the walls. And the reason why I say that, because commutation is important to me, because people change. And if part of that change means that someone is going to become a taxpayer instead of a tax burden, then why burden the taxpayers with more taxes? It doesn't make any sense. You got plenty of people that are just sitting in prison that are ready to come home and do the right thing, and they want to do the right thing, if given the chance or given the opportunity to, and because of political purposes or political reasons, these people just aren't giving a rat's behind about it. And that was another reason why I ran for sheriff in 2010. I ran for sheriff in 2010 of Suffolk County against the current sheriff. I was able to receive almost 30,000 votes, which was very beneficial, and I was very shocked at that as well too, because it was my first official run. So a lot of politicians have been sending me letters and asking that I do it again, stating that I do it again. But Mr. King has been a part of me being rehabilitated, because I believe that at the time, if I didn't hear from somebody like him, who knows where I would be? Because I said it a long time ago, when you're young, you're dumb. And and that's for everybody. That's for everybody. When you're young, you're dumb. And I didn't want to see nobody come to me with no suit and tie telling me how to behave in my neighborhood. So Arnie King was a tremendous outcome on the reason why I turned into the person I am today, which is a taxpayer, a father, someone who takes care of his responsibilities. I'm laid off currently, but I'm not out there breaking laws. I'm not out there hitting people over the head. I'm out there trying to do right by me and my family.
Thank you. Thank you, Hassan. In wrapping up our panel, I just want each of you to give us, yes, and you could do it as your final comments, Jamie, thank you. Everybody, please, give us a final parting comment that will help us to think about why we have all convened here today.
I just hope that they do something with public policy that will make commutation more streamlined instead of, I mean, they need to change something. You know, they need to change something and also start giving people parole.
Parole should be presumptive. And I think that's just a fact. A judge sentences someone to a parolable sentence. It is presumed that that person will be given parole. And I think the burden should shift from the individual proving that they have been rehabilitated to the state proving that they should be kept in prison. And so that's number one. Number two, commutation exists because there should be discretion in the system. There should be times when, you know, a decision is overridden. But the people who have the power to override the decision are the wrong people. They are people who are overly exercised by the politics of power and the preservation of themselves in a place of power. They are people who are ill-prepared and unwilling to take the risk to exercise the necessary discretion to really, you know, make real what we all know is true, that we all change and we all deserve the opportunity to make something different of our lives, no matter what we may have done.
Go ahead.
So one of you.
Let me say this, that one of the things that I recognize is that there are things that the parole board doesn't understand in terms of how they affect or their decisions ultimately affect victims. I had the opportunity to speak on behalf of a brother at a parole board hearing where, unlike many who go to the parole board to speak on behalf of the individual who's requesting a parole, and to say that he's a good boy, so to speak, and that he's done well in prison and you ought to let him out for that reason. What I tried to share with the parole board was that in many cases, and I by no means take the position of a spokesman for victims. I can't speak for all victims, but I can speak for those that I know and that I've come in contact with and who share the same belief as I. But victims many times are not capable of going to a parole board, such as what Tina said, and say, let this man go. Victims are caught up in emotional turmoil that does not allow them to be capable of that. So I said to the parole board, you have an opportunity to lift the burden from this family, from these victims who come to these parole board hearings year after year after year to face the perpetrator and to relive the whole scenario. This is more traumatizing in many cases than the actual crime itself. So victims are not able to do that for themselves. But the parole board in this instance has the opportunity and has the power to be able to do that for the victims. I believe I saw that come to pass. The individual I went for was paroled. Was it because of what I said? I don't know. Clearly, I'd like to think that it had some bearing on their decision. However, what I do know is that those victims have been freed of some things and no longer have to go back to the parole board anymore to deal with that over and over and over. So now, they now have a permission to move on and to heal and to live their lives and to not be controlled by the incident that occurred. And I think that is one factor that the parole board should begin to consider. What you're doing to the victims yourself may be worse than what the perpetrator did to the victim because you're holding the victim hostage. 30 years later, thank you.
Thank you. Hassan, we have that much time.
Okay, I just want to piggyback off of what Mr. Jones talked about in that much time. The reason why I believe that a setting like this is so important because it lets us know and lets us see what's really going on in our communities, what our elected officials are doing. You know, I don't care what color they are, what nationality they are. If they're not doing the right thing, get them out of there. If they're not doing the right thing by the people, get them out of there. You know, and that's what I've always said, that's what I've always believed, and that's what I stand up for today. One of the things that I also do is I mentor youth during the day, voluntarily, on my own time. And the reason why I do that is because I would hate to see another child experience what I experienced as a juvenile delinquent.
Yes.
So that's what my summary of today's meeting is, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. And thank all of our panelists again. I want to again reiterate and thank Jamie and Milton for being here. It takes compassion and bravery, and I thank you. I thank you for being here and for sharing with us today. Thank you very much.
Again, I'm a staff attorney with Prisoners Legal Services. Prisoners Legal Services was formerly Massachusetts Correctional Legal Services and was founded in 1972. We don't do any criminal work, but we do civil litigation on behalf of prisoners across the state, in state and county correctional facilities. We're a pretty small staff, so there are lots of things that we would like to do, but you know, unfortunately, we're somewhat limited. But we do have several class actions pending. There was recently a case of Disability Law Center on prisoners with a serious mental illness and segregation. That was favorable, and you can get all this information on our website. Just look up Prisoners Legal Services of Massachusetts. And we're currently suing some phone companies over the prison rates. Patty's part of that case as well. And we have a number of other segregation and county fee-related cases that I'd be happy to talk to you more about. But that's just to give you a flavor of the kind of work that we do. But I'm going to sit down now and talk to you about what Leslie was going to talk to you about, which is elderly and dying prisoners. But before I do that, I want to read a couple statements because we had letters sent to us from people on the inside expressing their frustrations with the parole and commutation process. We wanted to kind of read them to you throughout the program today, but because we got started a little late and wanted to make sure we got certain people out who needed to be out in time, they haven't been read. So I'm going to read just a couple of them right now. This first one is anonymous, but it's from this spring. I can understand that the parole board had and raised some concerns about whether I was a good candidate for parole, but this went far beyond that. This was psychological abuse. It is one thing to tell a man you are not ready for parole, but it is something else to deliver that message in such a cold, vicious disregard to humanity. It's something else to strip a man of all hope, rob him of any thoughts of redemption, and take away the concept that change is possible, then just leave him naked to the raw despair of hopelessness. And then one more, and this was actually an excerpt from a letter that was presented to the Governor's Council presenting concerns about the current members of the parole board at one of the renomination hearings. And this is by, I think I can say his name, but maybe I shouldn't just in case, but from MCI Shirley. Thank you for this opportunity to express some truths about growing into the elderly population in the prison system of Massachusetts. Oh, sorry, no, this isn't that one. As of late, numbers of lifers are dying in the prison health services units. Their sentences turned into death penalty sentences since Governor William Weld's administration, when this one and only commutation turned into an embarrassment, causing future governors to deny giving commutation solely to protect their own political agenda. Thus, lifers are now political prisoners. The DOC presently has a large elderly and handicapped population who cannot fend for themselves, nor are they able to reside within the structured cells limited to handicapped cells. Those bedridden awaiting their going home to our Lord, what he says in parentheses, are not allowed family to come sit at their bedside or even fellow prisoners who are friends. Most do not receive their religious last rites. To be painfully honest, it's cruel to see on a daily basis. The DOC talks about security. Well, they must be blind to not see and know that young lifers are seeing this and are going bolder towards staff, other inmates, and will eventually become uncontrollable due to knowing there is no hope through courts or commutation. So I wanted to at least read those, because I think it's important to have those voices in the room. And now I'm going to sit and join the panel and talk a little more about elderly and dying prisoners. Okay. Can people hear me? And the other one was a little louder, but I tend to be soft-spoken, so I'll try and account for that. So as I said, I've been at Prisoners Legal Services as an attorney there. I've been there for about a year. Before that, I was with another legal services agency doing foreclosure defense and education work, representing students in discipline hearings, expulsion and suspension, which many of you have heard of the cradle to prison or school to prison pipeline. So now I'm at the other end of the pipeline, and it's as clear as day that that's what's happening. And so I think to start this off, we haven't talked too much about overcrowding. Gavi did mention it in his presentation, but Massachusetts and many other states across the country are suffering from a serious overcrowding problem. We're at, on average, 144% capacity. Some facilities are well over 300% capacity. And the gentleman did mention Attica before, and it's not unrealistic to think that something like that could happen here in Massachusetts, or that we'll find ourselves in the shoes of California, which under a Supreme Court ruling has had to release tens of thousands of prisoners. So under the guise of that, it's pretty hard to believe that we're not using tools like parole and commutation at our disposal. One other thing that Massachusetts doesn't have is medical parole. The number of prisoners over age 60 has increased by 84.4% between 2000 and 2009, and obviously continues to rise. The annual cost of care for aging prisoners is estimated to be well into the 80,000 numbers per year. And that includes the annual cost of incarceration, which is around 40,000, 46,000. And often exceeds 100,000 for those with exceptional healthcare needs, which I will say is not rare. We have many cases where we're talking about end-stage liver cancer, pretty high maintenance terminal illnesses. So the state is spending millions a year on this discrete population alone, despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of them pose little threat to society. And I was sort of cringing in my seat when all of the former and current parole board members were saying, so hard to predict human behavior. It's like, well, not for this population, so give me a break. We're talking about people literally on their deathbed, confined to a hospital bed, can't eat by themselves, eating through feeding tubes, in a wheelchair, need help eating, going to the bathroom, and they're being denied parole. So if you can't get pretty close to 100% in predicting human behavior for that population, then who are you going to predict it for? So that's just an excuse, and we shouldn't accept it. That's BS. So last year, an inmate whose case I worked on was dying of cirrhosis of the liver and end-stage liver cancer, and needlessly died in custody despite our efforts. His DOC care provider stated that he likely had only weeks to live when he applied for early consideration for parole. He was actually recommended parole by the DOC based on his medical condition. The then parole board actually voted to release him. Then the Sinelli incident happened, and they actually went back and pretended that they hadn't voted to release him and that it was just a recommendation. We filed suit. The judge called the decision arbitrary and capricious, sent it back to the parole board. The parole board wrote a very lengthy decision justifying everything they had previously said and denied him again. We filed for reconsideration, and while that was pending, he died. He had served 25 years for his crimes, had never injured anyone in his crimes, and he was 57-year-old, but he looked like he was about 80. Another client of mine died just a few months ago. He was a perfect candidate for commutation, but he wouldn't outlive the process or the unpromising results that he would likely receive. At least 36 states have provisions for medical parole, which many states treat as a form of clemency, as you heard Gavi talk about. Well, it is a form of clemency. But Massachusetts isn't one of them. The provision that my client applied under was called early consideration for parole. And only a very small fraction of state prisoners whose offenses were committed before 1994 qualify for that kind of parole, and whose sentences carry a 2/3 parole eligibility. So it's a very, very limited number of people. So there's really no medical parole in Massachusetts. And even under that provision, it says, a compelling reason is serious medical or physical condition. But as I described, it's very difficult to get that, even under those conditions and under the reality of this parole board. In 2006, Georgia approved 107 cases of medical compassionate release. 107 cases of just medical compassionate release. And former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm granted 183 commutations, and a third of them were for sick and dying prisoners. Oklahoma, Arkansas, Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, Wisconsin all regularly approve commutations and medical parole for sick and elderly prisoners. And why? Because it's smart and it saves a lot of money. But somehow that doesn't work here. The standards and limitations vary from state to state, but generally, it's the formula is a balancing of punishment with the cost that it would be to actually treat the prisoner, and allowing the cost to society of allowing the prisoner to die outside of custody. But these folks are still subject to parole in the majority of cases in other states. And the medical director, in the majority of cases, also is the one who makes the initial call on whether or not this person would be a threat to society based on their medical condition. And in some cases, prisoners or their family members can actually petition for medical parole. Now, here in Massachusetts, Senator Pat Jalen did file a bill, Senate Bill 1213, for medical release of inmates, which would have required final approval by the commissioner, no parole board, which was great, except that the Public Safety Committee gave it an unfavorable vote this year. So it's dead in terms of the legislative process. So I guess going forward, things look bleak for medical parole, but we need it desperately, and I think the fact that 36 states have it, and states recently in the last 5 years have started to implement medical parole is promising for Massachusetts, and that we should keep pushing for it. Reintroduce Pat Jalen's bill, rally behind the bill. You know, you're all here. Many of you aren't plugged into this stuff, and it's part of the, my pitch is get in touch with us, myself, Patty. There's people out there in the audience too, Lois and Jean, and others who are involved in a coalition that's trying to work on changing parole policy. And we would love for you to join forces with us and make that happen because, as you know, power's in the people and in numbers, and we need numbers. So thank you.
Hi, because it's 20 to 7, and I want to say a few other things in response to what I heard today, I'm only going to speak a few minutes about what I was supposed to talk 10 or 15 minutes about, and that is the importance of the revitalization of commutation in Massachusetts for young people, people who went into prison when they were 15, 16, 17 years old, and are still in prison because they're doing natural life without parole, and there's no way for them to get out unless their sentence is commuted. We have 60 people in Massachusetts serving time for a crime, serving a life sentence for a crime they committed as a 15, 16, or 17-year-old. 60 people doing that kind of time. There are over 100 more who committed their crimes when they were 18, 19, 20 years old. And what we've learned in the last 15 years about adolescent brain development tells us that those people should not be given up on the day they walk in the prison door, and that's what we do. All of the brain studies, all of the work that's been before the Supreme Court proves without any doubt that children's brains, that people's brains are not formed fully until they are between 21 and 25 years old. They don't have the ability to regulate behavior, to form personalities, to form characters, the executive function of your brain is not developed. You can't do all those things, and hence, our United States Supreme Court, our conservative court, who is not what I would call the bastion for justice when it comes to criminal cases, has said some amazing things in finding that adolescents should be treated differently than adults. And I'm just going to read a couple quotes so you get an idea of how certain this science is and why in Massachusetts we've got to be getting commutation for these kids who are kids. I mean, Arnie is one of them. He went in as a teenager. They're not kids now. Some of them are in their 50s, 60s years old. But they were kids when they went in, and they're never going to get out unless we start developing this commutation system in Massachusetts. Maybe the Supreme Court will give us some relief on it, maybe for some of those people, but not for all of them. So here's a couple things the Supreme Court said about kids in prison. In Roper versus Simmons, the court said, even the most serious murder cases, there are 3 general differences between adolescents and adults that, quote, demonstrate that juvenile offenders cannot with reliability be classified among the worst offenders. As compared to adults, teenagers have a lack of maturity, an underdeveloped sense of responsibility. They are more vulnerable and susceptible to negative influence and outside pressure. Their character is not well formed. This is our Supreme Court. The next case that came down in 2010, the court said, because juveniles have lessened culpability, they are less deserving of the most severe punishment. The court went on to say, it is these features of youth that, quote, make the court decide it would be misguided to equate the failings of a minor with those of an adult. The Eighth Amendment forbids states from making judgment at the outset that young offenders will never be fit to re-enter society. And that's what we do in Massachusetts every day with our kids who are 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20 years old. We decide at that point in their life they should never get to come back into society. And that's what this Supreme Court is saying is the wrong thing to do. And our parole board has to start to listen to that. When my students raise adolescent brain development at their parole hearings, this is what they get. We've heard that. We've heard that. Go on. What else do you have to say? This has got to stop because this is now the law. You've got to consider the age at the time of the crime. You've got to look at these factors about kids, and the parole board has got to change. So I had a whole lot more to say about kids in commutation and race, because look at the kids that we lock up. That's the chart I gave you about race. As only 6% of the kids under 18 in Massachusetts are black. Guess what the percentage of kids doing juvenile life without parole is? 47% are black. They're only 6% of the population. So those are the kids we're locking up, and those are the kids we have to do something about. Now, I'm not going to give you the whole rest of my spiel because it's late. The one thing I do want to address is that what can you do? There's 7 members of the parole board. They're appointed by the governor. But first, the governor nominates. He makes a nomination. The nomination then goes to the governor's council, and there's a public hearing at the governor's council about whether that person should be appointed or reappointed. A present parole board member who has an extremely low rate of parole, and when you're talking about this board, if you're on the lowest end of this board, you're like really low. Her term of office runs out on June 2nd. I am urging everybody to write to the governor, call the governor. We've got mailing lists, we've got emails we can send out to people. We're going to send out lots of stuff on emails this week. Don't renominate this person. She was a victim rights advocate in the Hampden County DA's office for 18 years, and at every hearing, if she says anything, and she often doesn't, that's where she is. The victim's rights, the victim's rights, the victim's rights, and there's nothing else gets considered. Lucy Soto Abbey. So her term of office expires on June 2nd. And she doesn't have to be renominated. You can urge the governor to nominate a criminal defense attorney, a social worker, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a teacher, a minister. There's all kinds of people that aren't on our parole board that should be. So a formerly incarcerated person would be an unbelievable bonus to have on the board. So the time is now. If the governor does renominate her,
Soto Abbey.
if the governor does renominate her, then you have to contact your governor's counselors and urge them to vote no. It's a 2-step process. The first is trying to get somebody good nominated. The second is trying to get them through the governor's council. If she gets renominated, then it's time to talk to the governor's council. We have gotten people off the board before. We have done it from organizing and calling and contacting, and it has worked, and it should work now because there's a lot of upset people. So
if you're interested, I'll have a sheet up here. You can put your email address down, and we'll send you the information, okay? If you could just include your name too, so we know who we're writing to.
And so lastly is the person that's got good news. Lastly is the person who hires people who get out, and who probably has hired more people who've gotten out than anybody will know or meet, because he is such a believer, such a great entrepreneur, and he runs all of these businesses, and he employs so many people who've gotten out of prison. Bob Robinoff.
Thank you. The presumption of good news is premature, however. I just want to express my sympathy to the people who came here with some hope and had to sit through the parole board lesson in whatever they were trying to give us a lesson in. And, you know, you couldn't expect any more than what you got. And I'm sick about it. And it's going to take me a few days to get over it. Because yesterday, I escorted Barry Wilson to prison, and today I listened to these guys. And especially I feel sympathetic for people who, you know, this is not going to change. And the person I worked hard for and I voted for and I'd vote for again is really responsible for all this. Did you hear him say that he had a part in picking the rest of the parole board? Yeah. Did you hear him say there were 30,000 prisoners and now there's 300,000? Did you hear her say she couldn't give Mel King a suggestion of how to make the system better? I mean, you know, and is anybody here from that parole board still here? No. What a surprise, huh? Did you see how many of them came early to hear the first panel?
They didn't have the decency and respect to hear you as we sat patiently to you. That's right.
I mean, you got, you know, the governor is to blame for all this. The black governor, who we all thought would be our hope and our prayer. And by the way, I tell him this when I see him. And I see him more than you'd think I would see him. Because I go to his fundraisers. See?
That's clever. It's very clever.
But the point, and one of the things I feel badly about is that people of color don't express to him directly how they feel. Because the people in this room will, if they got a chance to meet him, but there are a lot of powerful people in the black community, in the minority community, Hispanic community. They don't say, I mean, you know, Mr. Gittins was patting Josh on the, shaking hands. You know, it was a joke. It was a joke. It's a joke, and at the same time, it's not a joke, because I remember when I was 17, 18 years old, and I was working in an auto parts place, and I got a police car to drive for 30 miles because it had to have a clutch replaced. So they gave me the car to drive. I drove that car, and everybody got out of the way on the highway. I knew what it was to have power for 30 minutes, to be in a position where everybody was afraid of me. I never forgot that feeling because I was blown up. Crazy. These people, they're blown up, and we would probably be in the same position they're in. It's the governor who has to appoint the right kind of people on the parole board who have had the background to have empathy. I would have loved to have said to these people, can you go to prison for a week anonymously so you can feel what it might be like? Okay. That's my speech. I'm sticking to it. Now, as far as jobs go, it's useless to hire a lifer. And I'll tell you why it's useless to hire a lifer. Because they take them away from you. I train people, I work with people, I mentor people. And guess what happens? One day, the parole board, some probation officer comes in and takes the guy off the street, and I find out 2 days later that he's got the keys to my store in a prison cell. I had a guy, you probably know him, Eford Brown. Zulu. Everybody remember Zulu?
Yeah.
Zulu only served 30 years in prison. It wasn't quite enough. See? So he was managing my store in Roxbury. And we were taking a day off a week and going to Northeastern, and we were going to Harvard, and we were going to a few more schools. And we were speaking, he was speaking about reentry and all this good stuff. And then one day, he didn't come to work. And he didn't pass a urine test, which he never went to jail for. He never went to jail for any of that kind of stuff anyway. And DeVal, and at that time, DeVal was being, it was his first term. And he didn't want me to write a letter or say anything, so he's still in jail. I got another guy in jail that I bought him a truck. He's the delivery guy for the furniture company. I still got the truck. It's now 2 years later. I finally gave the truck away. And you know, I invested money in these guys, in time, in heart. And another guy I had who served 20 years in prison, fortunately, is now the owner of the bookstore in Roxbury, the Black Bookstore. And he and I are really great friends. And it only worked out, though, because Barry Wilson saved him from going to prison. Because he and I could afford a lawyer to keep him from going back on some crazy accusation like the rest of these guys go back on. So I can't hire a lifer. Why should I hire a lifer and spend the time involved in him when they're going to take him away for some crazy, esoteric, minute experience that they have? Like the lady said, Tina said, she's scared. I'm scared. My employees are scared. And if it's not a lifer, it's still a problem. So I still hire people if I can. But I have this conversation, you know, with myself and with my family, and with my, I guess I don't have it with my employees, but, so I just want to look at my notes for a second, and, the last employee, they took him away 7 months ago. He still hasn't heard yet. There's going to be a number of people who are going to hear. And I also went to parole board meetings and hearings, and all I hear about is what the guy did 25 years ago. Is he sorry? And I went to the last parole board hearing I went to. They said, the guy said, how far away were you when you shot him? This was 20 years ago. And he said, about 200 feet. And Josh said, you mean you got over and you traveled 200 feet and got underneath that table when the shooting occurred? And he said, yeah. So I went to visit this guy in jail about 3 months later. And I was sitting in that room where you visit people. And I said, in the room, you know how wide that room is, right? And I said, hey, Jim, how far is 200 feet? And he said, oh, about from that wall to this wall. And I turned to the two guards that stand there like this to make sure you don't, get in trouble. And I said, how far is the distance between these two walls? And he said, 16 feet. Oh. Okay, so, it's a big problem. I think you got to march through Dover and through Newton and through Brookline to make a difference, because marching in Roxbury doesn't seem to help. The people here, it's like preaching to the choir. So everybody here has got the same problem. So I really think you should have another conference like this. Everybody here should bring 5 people more. You should demand that the governor come.
Right.
You should demand that they don't talk, they listen.
Right.
Everybody behaved themselves magnificently. I mean, I can't believe you gave these people the kind of respect that you did. And you really should be applauded for that.
One needs it.
but maybe they'll come back again. You know, maybe they'll come back again. Because they were treated so nicely this time.
Yeah, get Tree to get the ball to come.
Yeah, but I mean, they've got to listen. This woman can't tell you she doesn't have any ideas. This kid, Wolfie, what's his name?
Gavi.
Yeah, he was great.
Right.
He had ideas.
Right.
She didn't have any ideas. She's sitting on the
Right.
parole board. That's all I got.
I thank our panel. We're gonna be wrapping up. I have to say some thank yous. I'm gonna give people. I'm gonna wrap up, and then if anybody wants to ask a question, they can. But I'm gonna wrap up for those who have to leave. We promised you'd be out at 7. You got 3 minutes. We have to say thank you to the King family, to Arnie King's family, who is here. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for everything. Kazi Torre, Diane Zimbabwe in the back of the room. This would not be going on today if it were not for this woman sitting in the back of the room here. For those of you who don't know Diane, please know her. The work of Patty Guerin and Liz and so many people. I see Lois Aarons in this room right here. She is like the resource person, gets us all the information. Barb Dugan was in this room somewhere. I was just left the federal prison. Barb Dugan was our only lifeline in that prison. We received our information through Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and that's the only way, a lot of times, that we knew that somebody was on the outside. I encourage all of you to start communicating with people who are in prison. I'm going to close by just offering one piece from a person who is currently incarcerated, who is inside, who says 2 things. 1, why don't captains, lieutenants, sergeants, housing, and work officers at the institution where you are housed have a say in commutation, parole, lower security matters? These individuals see us every day, 8 hours a day in the housing units and at work. Why aren't those people here at the table saying who sentences should be commuted? And also, lastly, the drug war in this country and the drug policy in this country are the underlying problem to all of this. The question from this person on the inside is, whatever happened to trying to understand about drug and alcohol addiction, state of mind, and intent while under the influence? So please, we want to encourage more of this dialogue. Thank you, thank you, thank you so much. I'm going to end there. There's one question in the back. Reverend Slayan.
First of all, I just want to extend our thanks and appreciation to the King family for putting this in. Patty Guerin and others that just put this together. It's just wonderful. But also, 2 things. Briefly, mass incarceration in the United States has now become a humanitarian issue. A major, enormous, it's a travesty. And in that light, it behoves us for us to begin what we always refer, we've been involved with, a community awareness campaign. What you see in Massachusetts is a reflection of what's happening around the nation. With respect to juveniles incarceration, the highest amount of those behind bars, they went life and life without parole, are minority kids as well. To the point some of them are just about 7, 10 years old, serving life and life without parole. It's a travesty in the United States, okay? And from several perspectives, it does become an ethical and moral issue. And we have to raise that particular moral and ethical and humanitarian question as well as we talk about this particular issue. And it's in that light in Massachusetts that we've been pushing this thing to create a lot of awareness, educate the community, because if our people are not educated, if they are not aware of some of the things that are happening with respect to influencing, transforming public policy, it affects you tomorrow. We have to be very proactive, very vigilant in influencing public policy. So finally, I just want to put in this little announcement. Thank you. In October, we'll be having a major conference. We're bringing Michelle Alexander. It's a 2-day conference from the 18th to the 20th of October. It's a strategic solution development conference on these issues. So please put it on your calendar. But thank you very much for this wonderful time.